My daughter wants me to remove the sleeves from this dress. The off-the-shoulder sleeves will be about half as much work as removing a regular sleeve, but the technique is similar for any lined bodice. If you look closely, you'll see there's top stitching where the sleeve is. There's also top stitching that stitches the inner lining to the seam, and there is the seam itself. I need to turn the dress inside out and get between the lining and the outer fabric. Seam rip out all of this stitching where the sleeve is and remove the sleeve. The first stitches can be hard to remove, especially on such delicate fabric, but it gets easier when the seam is open in a spot. I need to remove the top stitching on the lining a little farther than the seam. That is so I can stitch the end of the seam where I stopped seam ripping it and secure it so it doesn't unravel. The seam is still held together. It's not coming apart, but this fabric isn't being held folded over the seam because I took out the top stitching right there. Trim thread ends and pick off loose scraps. The removed sleeve could be upcycled. Maybe it could be used for cuffs, doll skirts, or just use the fabric for another project. Be sure to match up both sides evenly when pinning them together. I do this by holding both ends and gently pulling them taut. I also like to start by pinning the center, then the center between two pins, and so on until my pins are close enough together that the fabric won't get misaligned while being moved. These fabrics are slippery, so I need the pins very close together. This side is flat, and this side was folded over and top stitched down, so I need to actually sew from that side to avoid pinching the fabric in the seam. Because this is such a flimsy fabric, it's a knit, a very thin knit, like a lingerie fabric on one side and a chiffon on the other side. So I need to keep the needles in as close as possible to when I'm about to sew over them, but pull them out before I start to sew over them. Always have the needle down when you have a flimsy fabric like this, when you go to reposition your fabric. And keep the presser foot down as well. I didn't have to mark my fabric because I can easily see the previous stitching line, and I'm just following that. Make sure you don't sew over any extra fabric that might be folded in the way. I'm looking at it like this because then I can see it with my really, really nearsighted eyes. With most sewing machines, you can't put your head up against it like that or you'll get conked in the head with the part that goes up and down. But in my machine, it's inside and I'm protected from hurting myself with it. And then I back stitch. Go forward a few stitches. Cut the threads off close. Here I'm using a thread cutter that's a part of my sewing machine. Oh, there's one. This is inside out. The stretchy fabric is the interior lining, and the seam is stitched down with a top stitch to the interior lining. And I'll need to go back and do that, but first I need to finger press it. This is the inside of the garment between the lining and the exterior fabric or outer fabric. I'm taking the round part of my scissors to kind of press the seam toward the lining fabric. Because that's the side it's going to be stitched down to, so it doesn't show on the outside of the garment. wants to slide off the table. It's very slippery. I'm not using my fingernail because my fingernail might catch on this very delicate fabric. I did notice there were some runs in the lining fabric from when I seam ripped. Thankfully, they are going to be on the inside and not seen. It helps to keep the bulk of the weight of the fabric on the table to help keep it from sliding. When I'm doing this, I'm making sure I pull the seam taut and have the seam allowance folded in the correct direction. I don't want to press it with extra fabric back behind the seam. I want it pulled flat and smooth. I don't want to press in any wrinkles. Right there's a little run in the fabric. This is where the two pieces of fabric are joined, and then this is the top stitching. Here's where it's been re-sewn after removing that portion of the sleeve. So I'm going to be continuing this line all around. And to do that, I don't want it to go to both sides of the seam, so I have to have my fabric opened like this to sew it. I'm lining up my needle and putting it right on top of the original top stitching that's left. And so, since I can't really see the thread or my top stitching line very well, I'm actually just lining up the previous seam with a place I can see on my presser foot. It happens to line up with the center mark on my presser foot. If you don't have a mark to line up your seam with, you can put a little line on it with permanent marker and then wash it off with rubbing alcohol later. Okay, so I'm overlapping. The top stitching actually comes all the way out to here. That's still left on the outfit. So I have some overlap. Stitch forward to back and forward again. Oh, it shifted a little. That's the problem with these flimsy fabrics. It did not stay in the right place. So there's probably going to be a little wobble. Hopefully it won't be too noticeable. Now this is a knit fabric for the lining, but not for the front. So I'm not using a stretch stitch. A stretch stitch would be too bulky for this fabric. Make sure to put your needle down whenever you're adjusting your fabric. And once again, I do not need pins this time, even though it's very flimsy fabric, because I'm just sewing right next to the seam. Folded neatly, laid flat, smooth it out. It's just a little bit stretched out from working it. So doing this light finger pressing will help. It'll be a good start, but it won't flatten out this stretched out area. I'll need to actually press it with an iron. Line dry. Cool iron if needed. So I'll go ahead and remove this other sleeve off camera, wash it, line dry it, and give it a little pressing if I need to after it dries, and then show you the final results. Christy is happy with the final result. Check me out on Facebook.